You know, when a bone breaks, an X-ray gives you this really clean, jagged white line. It's binary, right? Immediate, indisputable.
Right. You can literally see the fracture right there on the screen.
Exactly. But when a civilization breaks down, or when you try to diagnose the structural collapse of a society using ancient texts, that diagnostic image is rarely clean.
Yeah, it's incredibly muddy.
It is. It's usually buried under centuries of mythology, theological drift, and just outright mistranslation.
Oh, the mistranslations are everywhere, yeah.
So today, we're pointing a repaired diagnostic lens at a 1,400-year-old text, and we are completely stripping away all that superstitious debris to look at the structural mechanics underneath.
Yeah, and those muddy waters are precisely what we have to navigate here. Because, the older a text gets, the more vulnerable it is to having its core operational logic replaced by, well, mythological imagery.
Right.
People take these complex sociological warnings and slowly, over generations, honestly, they turn them into ghost stories.
Which brings us to the specific mission for today's deep dive. We are analyzing a lecture series from the Toli Islam Digital Audio Archives.
Specifically, lecture 11 out of 13, right?
Exactly, lecture 11 out of 13. The text in question is Surah Maryam, Ayat 68 through 75. And the parameter we are setting for this analysis is absolute.
We have to be strict about this one.
Very strict. We are removing all the medieval imagery. There will be no discussion of literal invisible demons with pitchforks.
None of that.
There is no physical body roasting in some supernatural fire pit in another dimension.
Yeah, if you approach these verses with that traditional superstitious overlay, you literally just get a horror movie.
You do.
But when you apply the analytical framework presented in this lecture, what emerges is this intensely rigorous corporate, economic, and political science critique.
It's fascinating.
It really is. It's a text mapping out the behavioral patterns of elite cartels and the automated mechanisms of systemic collapse.
Okay, let's start by looking at that traditional narrative, just to establish the baseline of what we're actually deconstructing here for you guys listening.
Good idea. Set the stage.
So if you read standard, centuries-old commentaries on this passage, the imagery is relentlessly dark. In this passage, things get dark fast.
Like Dante's Inferno dark.
Exactly. The standard translation suggests that God swears to round up all human sinners alongside literal physical devils.
Right.
The text supposedly dictates that these masses will be forced to crawl on their knees around this roaring pit of hell, and then the worst rebels will be plucked out and burned alive while the wealthy elite just mock them from afar.
It's presented as this terrifying, otherworldly scene of deluge judgment.
But you're saying that's all wrong.
Completely wrong.
Yeah.
That interpretation is the absolute peak of mythological distortion. The source lecture forcefully argues that this text is not describing a supernatural event in some afterlife dimension.
Okay, so what is it describing?
It is charting out the precise mechanics of systemic collapse right here in this world.
Wow, okay.
Yet the framework being applied is based on what the text calls the law of requital, or makafat iyom.
Makafat iyom.
Right. This is not some delayed mystical judgment. It is the literal law of cause and effect applied to human sociology and economic structures.
But, if we are stripping away the whole pit of fire imagery, we have to deal with the specific vocabulary that's been historically used to justify that imagery, right?
We do, yeah. We have to look at the Arabic.
The most obvious one is Jahannam, which is pretty much universally translated into English as hell. If it's not a supernatural fire pit, what is the systemic definition being presented in the lecture?
So in the Tolu Islam framework, Jahannam represents the socio-political reality of a society experiencing maximum friction.
Maximum friction. I like that phrasing.
It's exactly what it is. When a societal engine seizes up because the oil of equity has run dry, the resulting heat and destruction, that is Jahannam.
So it's an economic state.
Economic, political, social, all of it. It manifests as hyperinflation, extreme wealth inequality, class warfare, and the complete breakdown of supply chains and social trust.
That sounds like a few failing states today, honestly.
It looks exactly like modern failing states or collapsing corporate monopolies. It is the natural consequence of a system that has just fundamentally violated the laws of balance.
Okay, so we're talking about structural friction, a machine tearing itself apart.
Precisely.
That leads directly to the next term in the text, which is jithya. In the traditional horror movie reading, this word is translated as people, like crawling on their knees in agony around the fire.
Right, the helpless sinners.
Right, so if we apply the structural mechanics lens here, how does that translation change?
Well, jithya represents a state of total structural paralysis. To really understand this, you have to look at the root of the word.
Which means what?
It implies being unable to stand up or move forward.
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, so when a corrupt network, whether it's a massive corporate monopoly, a failing nation state, or some unchecked financial system, when it runs out of resources to exploit, it hits a wall.
It gridlocks.
It totally gridlocks. It can no longer advance. It's brought to its knees under the sheer, unmanageable weight of its own internal contradictions.
So it's not a medieval torture chamber at all.
Not even close. It's pure mathematical gridlock.
Okay, I have to push back a little here, though.
Sure, go for it.
Because if you're listening to this and you know the text, or, if you're just naturally skeptical of modern reinterpretations of ancient documents, you might think this sounds a lot like retrofitting.
I hear that criticism a lot, yeah.
Right, like it sounds like taking a 1,400-year-old theological document and trying to make it sound like a modern macroeconomic paper.
It does sound like that at first glance, I admit.
So how does the lecture prove that this isn't just a convenient modern spin? Because we have to look at the phrase regarding gathering people with their Shein.
Ah, yes. The Cheyenne.
The word Shein literally translates to devils. I mean, it is heavily laden with supernatural baggage. How can you possibly argue that word doesn't imply an invisible supernatural entity?
Because you have to trace the etymology back to its pre-mythological roots. The word Cheyenne comes from a root that means to be intensely distant from the truth, or to act with a burning, destructive intensity.
Wait, really? It doesn't originally mean a literal demon?
Absolutely not. Long before it was adopted as a proper noun for some supernatural bogeyman, it was just a descriptive term.
Okay, so in the context of this sociological critique, what are they?
They are human actors. They are the ringleaders. They are the predatory forces of economic and ideological manipulation.
The human architects of corrupt systems.
Exactly. We were talking about the lobbyists writing exploitative tax loopholes, the corrupt regulators looking the other way, the architects of predatory loan schemes.
Wow. So those guys, the ones manipulating the market, those are the Shein.
Precisely. They are the individuals whose actions are entirely removed from the principles of systemic balance.
That completely flips the imagery.
It does. Now, the text states that these corrupt actors will be gathered or clustered together.
Right, and the mythological reading visualizes them physically chained together in a fire pit.
But the systemic reading asks a very logical question. What happens when an exploitative system collapses?
The people running it get caught in it.
Yes, the people who designed the exploitative networks are naturally trapped within them. Corrupt actors are inextricably clustered with the very exploitative systems they created.
They can't escape the blast radius of their own policies.
Exactly. They are gathered in their own wreckage.
That structural clustering makes a ton of sense. Like if you build a massive fragile derivatives market.
And it suddenly collapses.
Right, and it collapses, the people managing those funds are the ones caught in the immediate epicenter of the liquidity crisis.
Yeah, and that ties directly into another highly misunderstood word in this passage, which is sure.
Right, because for anyone familiar with the modern geopolitical or theological landscape, the word Shia immediately signifies a specific religious sect.
Yeah, but the lecture is arguing that this is entirely anachronistic for the original text.
Completely anachronistic, right.
Completely. In classical Arabic sociology, the word Shia literally translates to a faction, a highly organized special interest group, or an elite cartel.
An elite cartel?
Yeah. It denotes a block of power that separates itself from the general population to operate for its own exclusive benefit.
So it's a cartel that insulates itself from the rules that govern everyone else.
That is exactly what it is.
Let's synthesize this causal chain for the listener because the mechanics here are just fascinating.
It really paints a clear picture.
It does. The text is outlining a sequence. You have these elite cartels, these Shia, led by their predatory ringleaders, the Shi'ana.
Right.
They build incredibly exploitative economic and political systems. They insulate themselves, assuming they're totally untouchable.
Because they usually are in the short term.
Exactly. But the law of requital, this automated cause and effect nature of human sociology, creates an inevitable bottleneck. The system experiences maximum friction, which is Jahannam.
The societal overheating.
Right. And when that friction peaks, the cartels are left, Jathia, completely gridlocked, paralyzed, and brought to their knees within the very collapse they engineered.
That is the exact sequence. Beautifully summarized. And what the source lecture really emphasizes is the psychological delusion of these cartels.
What do you mean by psychological delusion?
Well, while they are constructing these systems, they operate under the assumption that they have outsmarted the foundational laws of nature.
Oh, like they think the math doesn't apply to them.
Exactly. They believe their wealth and their insulation grant them immunity from consequences. But the text insists that the laws governing human development and societal stability are as immutable as gravity.
You can't cheat gravity forever.
You really can't. You cannot build an empire on resource extraction and extreme inequity and expect it to sustain itself. Eventually, the structural integrity just fails.
This introduces a really critical friction point, though.
What's that?
Well, if a corrupt system hits this gridlock, if the cartel is brought to its knees, is there a bailout mechanism?
Ah, the bailout.
Right, because the traditional religious narrative often presents a loophole. There is this widespread idea that hell is essentially a temporary laundry facility.
A cosmic sanatorium, yeah.
Exactly, a sanatorium.
Huh.
You go in, you suffer a bit to burn off your bad deeds, your record is wiped clean, and eventually, you get upgraded to heaven.
Right.
So does the Tului Islam framework allow for that kind of temporary consequence? Can the elites just do their time and bounce back?
The source text fiercely critiques and rejects this sanatorium myth. The lecturer spends considerable time on this exact idea because it fundamentally undermines the concept of cause and effect.
So it's just a comforting myth.
It's a comfortable myth designed by those who want to avoid ultimate accountability. The evolutionary philosophy present in these sources demands a completely different understanding of what these states actually are. Well, heaven is not some magical resort you gain entry to after a period of punishment. It is the state of continuous intellectual and evolutionary advancement. It is the active development of human potentialities.
Which means the definition of hell has to be its exact opposite.
Right. If heaven is continuous growth, hell is the failure to grow. It is total stagnation. It's the atrophy of human potential.
Wow.
So when you define the terms systematically like this, the idea of a temporary sanatorium becomes logically incoherent.
Let me try to contextualize this with an analogy that fits the scale of what we are discussing, just to make sure I'm wrapping my head around it.
Yeah, go for it.
The temporary punishment idea treats human development like a parking ticket.
Right, you pay the fine and move on.
Exactly. You pay the fine, the slate is wiped clean, and you just drive away. But the text is treating human development more like complex engineering.
Yes.
It's kind of like trying to run a modern, highly advanced artificial intelligence on a motherboard built in 1995.
That's a great way to look at it.
The computer isn't being punished for its sins. The principal architect isn't torturing the machine out of anger. It literally just lacks the processing capacity to handle the advanced environment. It just crashes.
That is a much more accurate representation of the text's philosophy. You cannot simply serve time in a state of stagnation like your 1995 motherboard sitting in a warehouse for 10 years and then magically be upgraded to handle a state of advanced growth.
Because you didn't actually grow while you were sitting there.
Exactly. Growth requires active, continuous development. Stagnation is not an externally imposed punishment. It is the natural, inevitable consequence of failing to develop capacity.
So if a society builds its entire existence around exploitation, zero-sum resource hoarding, and just superficial metrics, it actually stunts its own intellectual and moral evolution.
It completely bankrupts it.
So when the inevitable systemic collapse happens, they're left with nothing because they develop nothing of lasting structural value.
And this brings us to a highly nuanced moment in the lecture regarding verse 71.
Oh, this is the one that scares everybody.
Yeah. The traditional translation of this verse often instills pure terror.
Yeah.
It usually reads something like, "There is not one of you but will pass over it," implying that every single human being must walk directly over the roaring fire pit of hell.
Right, on some microscopic bridge or something.
Exactly. But the lecture breaks down the specific Arabic word used here, which is warid.
Okay, so if we are entirely abandoning the literal fire pit, what does warid actually mean in a socio-political context? Because I know the root has to do with approaching water, right?
It does, yes.
But approaching a watering hole sounds peaceful. Why use that specific word for a systemic collapse?
To understand the impact, you have to look at how a nomadic or classical society viewed a watering hole.
Okay.
It is the absolute center of survival and gathering. Everyone must go to the water. The lecture explains that worried means to arrive at a destination or to witness an event. The text is stating that everyone, both the corrupt cartels and the rationalist minority, will be brought to witness this systemic collapse. Everyone approaches the historical moment of gridlock.
But approaching the edge of the crisis does not mean falling into the crisis.
Precisely. The text clarifies that those who have lived according to the laws of balance, those who have developed their evolutionary capacity, rather than relying on the cartel's exploitative infrastructure, they witness the collapse, but they do not fall into the Jahannam of societal breakdown.
They don't fall in.
No, they are insulated from the crash because their internal operating systems are fundamentally sound.
That changes the entire visualization for me. You are standing at the precipice of a massive historical correction.
Right.
Think about the collapse of the dot-com bubble or a sovereign debt crisis where a national currency just hyperinflates to zero. You are there. You live in that timeline.
You can't avoid being in the timeline.
Exactly. You approach the worrid, the gathering point of this historical data. You witness the panic, the gridlock, the complete paralysis of the Shio cartels.
Yeah. But because you didn't over-leverage your existence, because you maintained a rational, balanced approach to your own development, you actually possess the structural integrity to withstand it. You observe the collapse, but you do not plunge into the abyss.
The ability to withstand that collapse comes from relying on data rather than delusion.
Data over delusion.
Exactly. And this highlights the core conflict presented in the next segment of the text. Because the elite cartels, since they operate entirely on short-term metrics and extractive wealth, they aggressively reject the warnings of the rationalist minority.
They always do. Which brings us to verse 73, which the lecture frames as the clash between the engine of reason and the tyranny of unproven assertions.
A great title for that dynamic.
It really is. If you're listening to this and wondering how the corrupt establishment defends itself when rational people point out that their system is unsustainable, this verse maps it out perfectly.
It does.
Because the elites do not respond with structural arguments, do they? They respond by pointing to their real estate. Right. The text uses a very specific phrase, asanu nadia.
Asanu nadia.
Yeah. It refers to having the grandest assemblies, the most opulent gathering places, the most impressive boardrooms.
The corner offices.
Exactly. When the rationalists present data showing that the supply chain is fragile or that the wealth gap is mathematically unsustainable, the establishment points to their material opulence as proof of their validity.
It is the ultimate corporate PR spin. I mean, we see this exact mechanism today.
Constantly.
A company is fundamentally rotting from the inside, their product quality is plummeting, their workforce is exhausted, but the CEO steps up to the podium and says, look at our newly designed corporate campus, look at our massive GDP, look at our stock buyback program this quarter.
Look at our bespoke suit.
Exactly. How can our policies be flawed when our assembly, our Asanu Nadia, is so undeniably grand?
And it is a devastatingly effective logical fallacy because human beings are easily intoxicated by visual propaganda.
We really are. We like shiny things.
We do. The elites substitute real data and human development metrics with raw material opulence. They point to their bank accounts and physical assets and basically say, I am rich, therefore I am structurally sound, I possess power, therefore I am morally correct.
They mistake economic bloat for evolutionary progress.
That is the perfect way to phrase it, yes.
But if you're listening to this and thinking, well, that sounds great in theory, but I look at Wall Street or I look at global authoritarian regimes and I see corrupt cartels winning every single day, the text actually anticipates that exact cynicism.
It absolutely does.
It demands that you, the observer, reject the visual propaganda and analyze the underlying data.
It explicitly warns that material power is not a shield against the law of requital. In fact, if that material power was acquired through exploitation and imbalance, it acts as an accelerant for the eventual collapse.
But that anticipation of our cynicism leads directly to what I think is the most difficult question in this entire framework, and the lecture addresses it in verses 74 and 75.
This is where it gets really deep.
Right, because if the law of requital is real, if this social physics equation always balances out in the end, how does the universe handle an elite class that refuses to look at data? Why do these corrupt systems sometimes last for decades or even centuries?
That's the million-dollar question.
We all know cartels, monopolies, or empires that seem to defy the laws of gravity for generations. They possess superior material assets, which the text calls athathan, and they have incredible physical appearances in PR machines, what the text calls Rhea.
Right. Athathan and Rhea.
So if the automated law of cause and effect is absolute, why aren't they immediately liquidated the moment they introduce corruption into the system?
This is where the lecture dives into the deep mechanics of complex systems theory. The law of requital operates on a historical database. It points the listener to the archaeological record.
Look at the ruins, basically.
Exactly. Civilizations fall when their internal operating systems break the law of balance, but the collapse of a massive structure is rarely instantaneous. There is a mathematical feedback loop, and it involves a concept the text calls Madah.
Madah. The lecture translates this as an extension, a prolongation, or a grace period, right?
Correct. When a systemic cartel chooses to live in delusion, when they ignore the structural warning signs and double down on their exploitative practices, the automated system of the universe does not immediately strike them down with lightning.
It doesn't just smite them.
No, it grants a madah, it lets the inputs run their course.
That is deeply counterintuitive to how we normally perceive justice or consequences.
It really is.
We usually assume that if someone is doing something structurally ruinous, getting away with it for 10 years means they have successfully beaten the system.
But within this framework, getting away with it is the most dangerous possible outcome. The madah is not divine approval. It is the automated system allowing the flawed data to reach its inevitable catastrophic tipping point.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. If a system chooses to extend its delusion, the universe essentially permits the extension. The corruption deepens, the structural rot spreads into every load-bearing pillar of the society, and the eventual collapse becomes a total, terminal liquidation rather than just a painful but survivable correction.
The source lecture uses a medical analogy to explain this feedback loop, and I think it completely reframes how you look at societal bailouts.
It's a brilliant analogy.
It compares the initial signs of systemic friction to physical pain. Pain is your body's data-driven warning system. It is a feedback loop telling you that something is functionally wrong.
It is the raw data demanding a change in behavior.
Exactly. So you have a sharp, localized pain. That's the warning. Now you have two choices. You can investigate the root cause, change your lifestyle, maybe undergo surgery that is listening to the data.
And it's painful in the short term.
Yes, it's painful, but it ensures long-term survival. Or you can choose to ignore the data and just take massive doses of painkillers.
And in this analogy, the painkillers are the athathan and riyah.
Right, the painkillers represent the material wealth, the athathan, and the visual propaganda, the riyah. You flood your system with painkillers, the warning sign disappears, and you look in the mirror and think, I feel great, I must be perfectly healthy.
But you haven't cured the underlying disease. You have merely silenced the alarm system.
And because you silence the alarm, you keep engaging in the exact same toxic behavior that caused the issue in the first place.
Which just makes it worse.
The disease isn't gone, it is mutating, it is spreading in the dark. And by the time the painkillers finally stop working, by the time the visual propaganda can no longer hide the reality, what started as a highly treatable ulcer has metastasized into a terminal cancer.
That period where the painkillers are working, that is the madah.
That's the grace period.
That's the grace period.
Okay.
To the outside observer, the system looks fine. The elites are throwing their grand parties and their asanu nadia. They count their athathan, they polish their riyah, and they declare themselves victorious over the laws of nature.
But underneath it all,
The systemic inequality and corruption are completely hollowing out the foundation.
which means the longer a corrupt system survives without correcting its core imbalances, the more violent its eventual collapse will be.
It happens slowly and then all at once.
Slowly, then all at once. I love that.
It is the terrifying reality of sociopolitical physics. When the artificial liquidity dries up, when the supply chains finally snap, when the population can no longer bear the weight of the extraction, the resulting Jahannam is absolute.
And the elite.
The elites are left jithia, gridlocked in the ruins, completely bewildered as to why their accumulated wealth cannot purchase a way out of the math.
They just can't buy their way out anymore.
No, they can't. They ignored the data for so long that the equation simply resolved itself without them.
And the historical record is the ultimate proof of this mechanic. The lecture challenges the arrogant elites of its own era, and by extension, the cartels of our era, to just look backward.
Look at the archaeological record.
Exactly. Look at the evidence. How many empires possess greater wealth, vastly superior militaries, and more magnificent architecture?
And where are they now?
They are dust. They are case studies in a textbook. They believed their material dominance exempted them from the fundamental laws of social balance. They chose visual delusion over structural data, and the automated system ultimately liquidated them.
The causality here is what's so compelling. It totally removes the necessity for an angry anthropomorphic deity doling out specific punishments
Huh?
and replaces it with a cold mathematical certainty.
A certainty that you can't cheat.
Right. A system built on imbalance will self-terminate. The only variable is time.
That is a massive paradigm shift. I mean, if we step back and look at the whole picture we've analyzed today, we have moved from a mythological story of demons in fire pits to a highly precise science of systemic collapse.
It's completely reframed.
We've established that material wealth is an illusion when it's used to mask structural rot. We've seen that elite cartels, the Shia and their human ringleaders, the Shayan, are mathematically doomed to gridlock and paralysis when they attempt to fight natural law.
The math always wins.
Always. And most importantly, we've learned that the meta, the grace period where corruption seems to be winning, is not a victory. It is simply the silent metastasis before the terminal crash.
It completely recontextualizes how you view historical survival and failure.
Wow. Okay, but this leaves us with an incredibly urgent question. Let's connect this to the bigger picture. We discussed the concept of the word, the idea that the rationalist minority approaches the historical watering hole, witnesses the massive systemic liquidation, but does not fall in.
Right. They witness but don't fall.
So material wealth is an illusion, and elite cartels are doomed. But what is the actual mechanism for the rationalist's survival? How does the broader system actively insulate and upgrade the path of those who consistently choose data over delusion?
It's a vital question.
When the established order is burning in the Jahannam of economic and structural collapse, what is the exact sequence of events for the people who actually listen to the warning pains?
The contrast in outcomes is absolute, and it requires its own dedicated analysis. That is exactly where the source material takes us next.
Oh, really?
Yes. In lecture 12 out of 13, the focus shifts to Surah Maryam, Ayat 76 through 87. We will be breaking down the law of continuous intellectual advancement, the final destruction of those corrupt power dynamics, and the ultimate consolidation of systemic authority for those who align their development with the laws of balance. I really look forward to diving into that sequence in the next session.
It is going to be a crucial continuation. I can't wait for that. But before we close the books on this session, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final thought to mull over, especially as you navigate the news cycle this week.
Always good to apply it.
Take a hard look at the global economy today, at corporate structures, at the political narratives being pushed by various factions. What warning pains in our current systemic structures are we just medicating with visual propaganda and wealth?
Where are we taking the painkillers?
Exactly. Where are we as a society swallowing massive doses of PR painkillers rather than actually addressing and curing the underlying disease? Keep questioning the data, keep looking past the X-ray, and we will see you in the next deep dive.